Greg Cronin had his introductory press conference being announced as the head coach of the Iowa Wild today. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll discuss what he said about developing young players.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll discuss Greg Cronin's introductory press conference for the Iowa Wild, his stance on developing players, what he brings to the table, and what he hopes to bridge between Iowa and Minnesota. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, host of Seth on Sports, credentialed media member, and Greg Cronin had his introductory press conference earlier today and had some interesting things to say about his development strategies and what he brings to the table as a coach with plenty of experience, something that the Iowa Wild have not had over the last couple of seasons. And what we're going to do is we're going to play the press conference for you, and then we'll react to it for the rest of the show, because there are some things that I liked, and there are some things that I'm going to need a little more elaboration on as his tenure gets going. So we will we'll just dive right in to Coach Cronin's introductory press conference, and as I said, once he's finished, we'll react to it here on today's show.
Well, again, hello everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. This is a big change for the Iowa Wild. Bringing in a coach, Greg Cronin, with the vast experience he has, not only in coaching, but also in player development. We're looking for our prospects to take big steps, and we believe Greg is the guy to lead the charge. So I'd like to welcome Greg Cronin to the podium now, please.
Okay. I'm blessed to have an opportunity to go back into the AHL. This will be my 8th year coaching in the league. I started out in Bridgeport in 2003. As Matt pointed out, back then, hockey hadn't evolved into a sport where there's this entourage of staff that follow the team around. The player development model was way different. I went back into the American League in 2018 after I was an associate head coach with the Islanders, New York Islanders, and really was my first introduction to watching really like modern sports utilize people to strengthen development. So, you have development coaches, strength coaches, analytical personnel. I think we're going to do our best job to maximize that staff so that our players can get a great experience developing at this level. So are there any questions?
Should we just fire them off?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think of Iowa so far?
Well, I've actually been here before. I was in college hockey back in the late 80s. I think I was here they used to have the Buck Bowl, which is a preseason USHL tournament. So I'm somewhat familiar with the city. When I was coaching in Colorado, we played here, I think, 2 or 3 times. So I was here in the winter time. And when I drove back from Colorado to Boston, I'd always stop in this area, whether it was Iowa City or just outside of Des Moines on the ride back. That was the last stop in my leg back to Colorado.
What are your thoughts?
Midwestern town. I mean, it's so different. Like, it's funny, like, and I mean this like personally, because I grew up on the East Coast. I'm a Boston guy, and I think I've seen more people say hello and be friendly in 24 hours here than I saw in 24 days in Boston, right? Like, the East Coast has got a little bit of a rougher, kind of a fast-paced lifestyle, and I think here, people are more grounded. There's a little bit of humble lifestyle here that comes out in the way people treat each other. So it's actually really nice. I think that's why they call it the Heartland. So I'm looking forward to it.
The accent it's thick. It's definitely thick.
Yeah.
What do you think about, coming here to Iowa, coming back into the AHL? Can you tell us about your coaching style?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, in my introduction, the American League has really evolved into a critical league for the NHL. With the salary cap and the salaries going up, if you can develop young players and they can come in there and play a role in the NHL club, I think it's a really salary friendly transition. Our job is to create some visibility for the players individually, and then allow that visibility to translate into I think a fairly reliable trajectory for the organization. When I was in Colorado, we saw Rossi come through here and Boldy, and I'm sure there's a few other guys that Tim Army coached that are now playing real vital roles for the Minnesota Wild, and that's what our job is going to be here in the next couple of years.
How do you think that winning affects personal player development?
It's a huge part of it, and I don't think any NHL or AHL GMs are going to say we just want to develop. We don't care about winning. They all say it, but it's hard to do. Like half the teams don't have winning records every year, right? So the winning part of it's critical, because when the players go to the rink and they're winning, they feel good about themselves. It creates good energy. There's a goal at the end of the year. When you slide out of the playoffs early, it becomes kind of a heavy march to the finish line. And, we want to make sure that we're not in that situation this year.
How personal do you take losses?
As I've gotten older, I've taken them more as learning experiences and less personal. It's funny, I got hired to go to Anaheim out of Colorado because of the development model that we established in Colorado. It was very predictable. I shared this with Matt and the staff when I went through the interview process. We had 30 players go through the Colorado Eagles in 5 years, make it to the NHL. And that's hard to do when the Avalanche were, annual Stanley Cup contenders, right? They weren't just playoff team, they were a Stanley Cup team. So the amount of spots for those guys was limited. So I think our process was able to create a pathway for those players to get into the NHL, whether it was through the Avalanche, whether it was like a Logan O'Connor, who came through as an undrafted free agent. Pavel Francouz was an undrafted free agent. They played on that Stanley Cup team. And then now recently, AJ Greer was with us, and he found his way into Florida this year and won a Stanley Cup. So, I think that pedigree in terms of developing is a reflection of the process that we're going to create here. And when we went to Anaheim, we used the same process there. It was a very unusual situation. There were 11 guys that were born in 2000 that played significant time there. And the top of that would be Leo Carlson, who obviously I think is going to be a superstar. And like maybe a lesser known guy that worked their way in last year would be a Sam Colangelo or a Nikita Nestorenko. Those guys were AHL products that went through San Diego and worked their way up. So ideally, we're creating that same, dynamic here, and I'm looking forward to getting after it.
You were in the NHL before. What experience can you take from those 2 years there that you can bring here?
Well, and these are you could have been in the interview process because they were asked during that too, right? So like they asked about that, and I think I have an advantage that I've spent the last 2 years as an NHL head coach, and then so my experience in the AHL clearly can speak to the roots, the grassroots level of development, and being in the boots in the ground with that, and then being an NHL head coach the last year, I can see the product of that, and I can speak to how that process transfers into the NHL. And I think any AHL player, when they talk to a coach that's coaching him in the AHL that just spent 2 years in the NHL, I think Mason McTavish is going to be a star, Leo Carlson is going to be a star, Lacombe's going to be a star, Dostal is going to be a star. Like when I'm a critical part of that process into the NHL, that just creates more credibility for me and the staff here.
What's your headshot's a little intimidating.
Where'd they come up with that, for God's sakes? It looks like somebody stunned me there. I was in shock mode. God.
What's your personality like, with that being said?
Well, I actually have a good sense of humor, as you can see. It's self-deprecating humor. I'm glad you brought that up. God, I saw that picture. I was like, whoa, this guy just got hit with a cattle prod, So, I come out as kind of an intense guy, and like somebody said to me, I can't change my face. I was actually talking to John Hines about this because Heinze's got he's kind of got a tough demeanor, right? The facade of Heinze, he's like no nonsense guy, and I think I smile more than Heinze does, but like I have an intensity to me that I would say is more of a passion. I'm very honest. When I do talk to players, I try to be honest, transparent with my behavior, and also compassionate. I think the generation today, the kids are a little bit more complicated. I don't have kids, so I wasn't going through that process with kids, but I think kids today, they need more one-on-one time, whether I like it or not. And, there is a negotiation with kids today. When I was coaching back in the late 90s in the NHL, there was a black and white world. You did it and you followed direction. You trusted your coaches and your teachers and your mentors. And now today, I think with the social media and the number of agents involved, and I think the kids have alternative information sources, and they can use that, to compare it to what you're saying. So you're not changing that. So you've got to respect that process, and you've got to, try and honor the kid's view of the world and try and, bridge a gap between what you think he can do and what he's not doing. Because I think, like, ultimately, when you're trying to push people through these glass ceilings, there's some pain involved. And I think as a coach, you have to have the conviction that your message is going to really help this kid get to another level. And, I think that's one of my biggest strengths as a coach. And sometimes you get some flack for that, but I'm willing to take the flack to push through it and see the kid get to another level.
What are some of your short-term goals?
Short-term goals and make the playoffs, and obviously try and, get these younger players that I think that are kind of earmarked for the Minnesota Wild, get them more prepared for that.
What makes you think you can turn around this team?
Well, I'm going to be very honest with you, right? You need good players, okay? So I'm not putting any pressure on Matt and the staff, but you need to have good players to win. If the players aren't that good, it takes more time to develop them. And I don't know the league that well. I wasn't on this side. We were on the west side, so I knew a lot of the teams out west in San Diego and Ontario. But like I said before, I think the process that I've been using for 2 decades here in terms of creating transparency and having the players committed to playing a certain way will give us some visibility on how these kids will evolve. But the mystery is, when do they figure it out? And you go back to the Anaheim Ducks, some of those guys took longer than we thought they would take. And you can take all the sports science you want, all the psychology you want. We don't have a measurement to measure somebody's emotional and mental maturity. And that's part of it, right? So, but I do think if you're consistent with your messaging and they trust the message, they will accelerate their development. So, in a perfect world, we get some good players here. And Matt and I have talked about that, in a rating system, what I think good players are and what they produce offensively. Ultimately, you got to have, when you look at plus minuses, you can have a lot of scores, but if they're minus double digits, you're not going to win a lot. And I just, last year, being respectful to the coaching staff, they had a similar problem we did in Anaheim. They had poor special teams. So one way to close that gap is just to improve your power play and your penalty kill. You should have done the interview when I was sitting down with Matt and the staff there.
I'm not free, unfortunately. Yeah, hammering at you.
Okay. All good?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, some interesting things that Greg Cronin had to say, certainly, and we will break them down for you here as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild right after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Rugiet. Guys, you've probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've even tried them. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Ready. Rugiet Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast, on average in 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. If traditional options haven't worked, Rugia might be the answer. Over 150,000 men have already made the switch. Head to Rugia.com/LockedOnNHL and use code LockedOnNHL to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNHL and use promo code LockedOnNHL for 50% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugia website for full safety information. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Tomorrow on the show, we are going to get some thoughts from Judd Brackett about the NHL draft, and we'll have a couple more draft previews for you, taking a look at some other centers that are available for the Minnesota Wild with their second round pick. Again, all we're doing as far as draft profiles go, that is looking at second round players, second, fourth, fifth, and sixth round picks. Not a lot to work with. So we'll get Judd Brackett's thoughts tomorrow, and we'll take a look at some other names that are available. But let's talk about what Greg Cronin had to say at his introductory press conference. And we're going to start with some of the things that I liked. Number one being that I like how he puts pretty much exactly what this Minnesota Wild team is going to be trying to do. Talked about with the salaries going up, with the salary cap going up, the AHL can be a really big benefit for teams to be able to accelerate the growth process of prospects to get them on the roster, because, you know, if you're spending high dollar on players at the top of your lineup, you've got to have players on cheaper contracts at the bottom. And if it's going to be some guys from the AHL, you got to make sure that they're ready to go. So being able to kind of accelerate the development process is something that just has not been, it's something that has not really been readily available for the Minnesota Wild over the last couple of years. The notion of predictable patterns for development is something that I would like some more clarification on, but in theory, it sounds good. Is, you know, you're putting a system together to develop these players so that, you know, when an injury happens or when a call up is warranted, that you know that you're going to have a large pool of players that are available and ready to go, as opposed to like, well, let's try this guy this time and see if he's capable of giving us what we're looking for. So I found that interesting from Cronin. Obviously, it's hard to argue with having 30 players get to the NHL level from the Colorado Eagles on his watch over those 5 years in their system. And I will say too, when this first broke, and everydayers will know this because I mentioned it when the news about Cronin was first coming out. The fans of the Colorado Avalanche, they thought Cronin did a fantastic job with their AHL affiliate. So he clearly has a track record of getting players to the NHL level. Now, sticking power, some of the players have certainly stuck, some have not, but his job is to get the players at the AHL level ready to go up. And I like the fact that Cronin said that the times have changed and that you can't use tactics that he used at the beginning of his coaching career. That doesn't work now. And it really is about catering that individual experience to a prospect and being able to work with them on a one-on-one level to get them to where they need to get to. Also understanding that players on a case-by-case basis may develop at different speeds. Just because player X does everything that the coaching staff requires or wants and gets through it and develops at a quick speed, it doesn't mean that that's going to work for every player that is in a similar situation. It is all about how a player responds to what the coaching staff is giving them, what the coaching staff is telling them, and how it fits what they are trying to do themselves. So there's a lot to like about what he said, and I think having a plan, something as rudimentary as having a plan and having a system to develop players, just puts the Iowa Wild so much further ahead of where they've been the last couple of years. You know, he hit on a very important point as well. When you are so far out of it so quickly, you really have nothing other than playing to the end of the season. You really have nothing that you're building towards or working to as the season develops. So trying to put plans in place, put a development system together is just going to put this team so much further ahead of where they have been over the last couple of seasons. So there's a lot to like about what Greg Cronin had to say in his introductory press conference. There are a couple of things that I'm going to need either further clarification about or am going to need to expand upon a little bit as we finish the show. So we'll take a look at a couple of areas that we just need to kind of dig into a little bit here as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild, and once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Once again, make sure to subscribe and follow us on YouTube and your favorite audio platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Just tidying some things up from the introductory press conference for Greg Cronin. We talked about the things that we like, things that I liked to hear from Cronin as he was introduced to the Iowa media. A couple of things that I just need some clarification on. One of the things that stood out to me is having already talked to Matt Hendricks, the Iowa Wild GM, about needing good players on the roster. Now, this is something that has been brought up in the comment section quite a bit over the last couple of years, because let's be honest, the Minnesota Wild have been far from healthy over the last 2 years, which means that you are dipping into that Iowa pool quite a bit, which certainly impacts what the Iowa Wild did on the ice or didn't do on the ice over the last couple of years. So is Greg Cronin going to have some say as to what this roster looks like? I like the idea of having a system, a rating system put together to kind of determine who fits, who doesn't. But does that mean that players that are maybe not as far ahead in the development process are going to be kicked to the curb? That just kind of stood out as interesting to me is the discussion about, you need to have good players. We have a ton of prospects on this team that need the guidance, and I know they'll get that guidance, but it's going to be interesting to see how many changes are made to this Iowa Wild roster now that you've got a new head coach that is going to be putting the plans together. The other part to this is Cronin touched on these special teams as being a weakness for the Anaheim Ducks over the last couple of years. It's been bad for the Iowa Wild. They've been bottom 5 in special teams, both power play and penalty kill the last 2 years. So that is going to need to be majorly addressed. And at this point, whichever coach in this organization is the first to figure out the special teams woes is going to get an immediate promotion to NHL head coach. But I didn't hear a ton in the way of suggestions for how to improve these special teams units. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Cronin has just started. He hasn't had a chance to really dig in and kind of get his hands dirty. So he could have ideas as to what is going to fix these units. But if not, then all of a sudden this is starting to become more of an organizational problem as opposed to simply the Minnesota Wild are bad at both. Now the Iowa Wild aren't great at both. Somebody needs to figure out what it's going to take in order to get those units humming along. And, for some of the concerns about Cronin's departure from Anaheim, I want to share a story that was circulated on X today in regards to Trevor Zegras and Greg Cronin. Now, Cronin, as we have heard, as he even said himself, he's kind of a no-nonsense guy. And I think the structure, I think the discipline is going to really help this Iowa Wild team. But we can't run from what came out of Anaheim after Cronin was let go, and the comments that Pat Verbeek had about it really not coming down to anything that happened on the ice. It had more to do with the relationships with the players and players themselves voicing concerns as to whether or not Cronin was going to be the guy to lead them long term. Bill Meltzer, who is the official site, is an official site contributor for flyers.nhl.com, had this to say earlier today, and I thought this was interesting. Greg Cronin was similarly hard pushing to John Tortorella, former head coach of the Philadelphia Flyers. He and Trevor Zegras had some go-rounds, so it's notable that Trevor Zegras won him over this past season. This quote that I'm going to read for you is from March during Zegras' suspension for the high hit that he had on a Flyers player. Cronin says, "We'll miss Trevor. He's been terrific this year. If you were to ask me one player that's probably made the most progress, even though the stats don't reflect it, it's him." And this, I think, perfectly encapsulates what the hope is that Greg Cronin will be able to bring to this Iowa Wild team now that he's been installed as head coach. Is he said himself, it's the kind of the tough love approach, and being tough on players, being realistic with players, trying to get the message to them so that they buy into it and believe it, and that helps them kind of take the reins of their own development. It's not going to work for every player. It's not going to hit everybody all the way across the board. But I think that small piece of it is such a big key to the development side, is the players have to buy in to the messaging from the organization, messaging from the team. What the team is telling you, this is what you need to do to get to the NHL level, to elevate your game and to move on to the next level, because that should be what this whole process is about. When a player is drafted and put into wherever they're at in the system, the goal should always be to get to the next level. It's not going to work for everybody. It's the same thing as school. We all went to varying levels of school throughout our lives. The goal should not be to hang around at a particular level and get comfortable and have fun. The goal is to push the players that are going to make the biggest impact up to the next level. And, whatever they need in order to get there, you have to be willing to give them as a coach. So I trust that Greg Cronin has done this before. I trust that he has a track record of getting players to the NHL level. I like that he talked about his experience, albeit not great, at the NHL level, as being a way for him to have looked at both sides of the door, to be able to understand what it takes to walk through that door and what it takes to walk into that next room and adjust to your surroundings, take a look at your surroundings, and understand what it's going to take when you get to that next level. So it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of interesting observation going on with Iowa this offseason and taking a look at what they do for the roster and how this tenure works out. But if the Wild did nothing other than bring in somebody with previous coaching experience, they found a guy that has plenty in Greg Cronin. So we'll see how his tenure shapes up as coach of the Iowa Wild. One thing before we go, if you have any, where are you at now that Greg Cronin has been installed, been introduced as the head coach of the Iowa Wild? Do you think he will have a successful tenure? Do you still have concerns as to what he brings to the table? Let us know in the comment section, and we'll track the responses, and we'll engage with you in the comment section here on today's episode. Whether you think this is going to work, whether you think there's no chance that this works, let us know in the comments. Thanks for tuning into today's episode. Once again, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.